This is another example of chronic inflammation, chronic pyelonephritis, chronic inflammation of the kidney, in which there is also heavy infiltration by chronic inflammatory cells, destruction of the renal tubules, with the preservation of the glomeruli. With the preservation of the glomeruli means the glomeruli are intact. These are the glomeruli, while this is the heavy infiltration of chronic inflammatory cells, mainly lymphocytes and histiocytes, within the renal tubules. High power showed high power of the lesion showed destroyed tubules in which there is hyaline material within the lumen, this red area, hyaline cast within the renal tubules, and heavy chronic inflammatory cells infiltration, mainly lymphocyte and histiocytes. A higher power also. This is the renal tubule, this is renal tubule, this is renal tubules. This is the hyaline cast. It is also called thyroidization of the kidney. This is a chronic inflammatory process in which chronic inflammatory cells, mainly lymphocytes, histiocytes, in the tubules and in the interstitium, result in destruction of the renal tubules with formation of hyaline cast and inflammation of the renal parenchyma. This is a chronic inflammation of the, and if we see the glomeruli are intact. There is no inflammatory process within the glomeruli. This is a chronic pyelonephritis. Thank you. This is another example of a chronic inflammation in which there is a chronic inflammatory cells in addition to giant cell. This is called giant cell granuloma in the soft tissue. These features regarding the giant cells and the chronic inflammation may aggregate to forming a granulomatous reaction. A granulomatous reaction may be specific and may be non-specific. In foreign body infection or foreign body inflammation, this is non-specific granulomatous reaction in which there is many chronic inflammatory cells in addition to giant cells, foreign body giant cells, in addition to fibrosis. The spindle cells here is fibrosis, fibroblast proliferation. These are fibroblast proliferation. This is giant cell, foreign body giant cell, and these cells are chronic inflammatory cells, mainly lymphocyte and histiocyte. This is granulomatous reaction. Foreign body, you should know that the foreign body giant cell is different from Langhans giant cell. In foreign body giant cell, the nuclei are distributed randomly within the cell, while in Langhans giant cell, distributed at the periphery of the cell. This is called foreign body giant cell. These are the features of chronic inflammation: fibrosis, chronic inflammatory cells formation, granulomatous reaction, foreign body giant cells. This is an example of granulomatous reaction in which there is many giant cells and fibrosis, fibroblast proliferation, in addition to histiocytes. This is an example of granulomatous reaction. That's all. Thank you. This slide represents acute inflammatory process of the kidney, in which there is heavy infiltration or multifocal aggregation of acute inflammatory cells within the renal parenchyma. This is an aggregate, this is an aggregate, these are aggregates of acute inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophils within the renal parenchyma. This is pus cells. These cells are pus cells, I mean neutrophils. Neutrophils. Neutrophilic cells. These are neutrophilic cells in addition to histiocytes. Neutrophil and histiocytes. This aggregate represent suppurative inflammation, means abscess formation, composed of many acute inflammatory cells. This is an abscess, this is an abscess, this is an abscess, this is an abscess. These are tubules. This is an abscess area, and also this is an abscess area. It is called suppurative inflammation, acute suppurative inflammation of the renal parenchyma. This is an example of acute pyelonephritis. Acute pyelonephritis. The glomeruli here are intact. The glomeruli here are intact. There is no inflammatory process. The inflammation is concentrated in the renal tubules and around and in the interstitium. This is acute pyelonephritis. Thank you. This slide represents an example of acute inflammatory process in which there is acute appendicitis. This slide is an acute appendicitis. There is heavy infiltration of acute inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophils, in the mucosa, in the lumen, in the submucosa, and in the muscle layer. These are the inflammatory cells infiltration. This is the lumen, pus cells in the lumen, acute inflammatory cells in the lumen. This is the surface area, mucosa, get ulceration and heavy infiltration with acute inflammatory cells. This is the muscle layer, also heavily infiltrated with inflammatory cells. And this is the serosa. Also, there is heavy infiltration of inflammatory cells. So it is transmural acute inflammatory cells infiltration of the appendix. This is called acute suppurative appendicitis, an example of acute inflammation. These are the inflammatory cells, mainly neutrophils, خلايا مفصصة, and histiocytes, few RBCs. This is an acute suppurative appendicitis, an example of acute inflammation. Pus cells from the lumen to the serosa. This is the serosa, and there is heavy infiltration of acute inflammatory cells. Acute appendicitis. Thank you. This slide represents chronic inflammatory process of the thyroid tissue. The normal thyroid tissue composed of thyroid follicles. These are the thyroid follicles containing colloid material. This is normally, but surrounding these follicles there is abundant fibrosis and chronic inflammatory cells infiltration. This is the fibrotic area, fibrous tissue formation, fibrosis surrounding the follicles. This is a chronic inflammatory cells infiltration. These are chronic inflammatory cells infiltration. This is the colloid material, this is thyroid follicles, and this is abundant fibrosis. This is a chronic thyroiditis. It is called also riddle thyroiditis. Riddle thyroiditis. This is a chronic inflammatory process of the thyroid tissue, chronic inflammatory cells, lymphocyte, fibrosis, and destruction of these follicles. You look that the number of the follicles are little, replaced by fibrous tissue. Replaced by fibrous tissue. This is the fibrous tissue, and these are the thyroid follicles. This is a chronic thyroiditis. It is also called riddle thyroiditis. Thank you.